The fog in the rust gills did not just obscure vision, it tasted of copper and ancient regrets. It was a thick, chemical soup that clung to the metallic walls of the lower decks of Aethelgard, turning the afternoon sun into a pale, sickly bruise in the sky. Kaelen Voss adjusted his rebreather, the mechanical hiss of the filter, the only rhythm in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. His hand rested on the hilt of his phase blade. It was a familiar weight, a comfort born from 4 years of the Shatter War. The weapon was cold, mirroring the ice that had settled in his marrow since the day the casualty lists had come back with Jory's name at the very top. Jory, who was only 19. Jory, who had wanted to be an architect of cities, not a casualty of a resource grab. He is close, Kaelen thought, his boots making a hollow clack against the rusted floor plating. The sensor on his wrist chimed, a low rhythmic pulse that signaled a non-human biosignature. A Lithos. Most people call them dust eaters or clinkers because of the way their skin sounded when struck by a bullet. To the citizens of Aethelgard, they were the monsters from the surface who had tried to extinguish the light of humanity. To Kaelen, they were simply the target, a target that needed to be neutralized to make the world feel a little less empty. He turned a corner into a narrow maintenance shaft, the walls weeping with condensation. There at the end of the corridor, a shadow moved. It wasn't the lumbering, mountain-sized beast the recruitment vids had promised. It was slender, jagged, and fast. "Stop right there, Clinker," Kaelen barked, his voice amplified by the external speakers of his combat vest. "Power down your kinetic shield and put your hands where I can see them." The shadow froze. It turned slowly, and for a moment, the flickering neon of a nearby noodle shop caught the creature's skin. It wasn't gray or dull. It shimmered with a fractured, iridescent light, like oil on water. Amber eyes glowing with a bioluminescence that felt uncomfortably like intelligence stared back at him. "I am not armed," the Lithos said. Its voice was a strange harmonic vibration, like two tectonic plates grinding together in a beautiful, terrifying melody. The accent was thick, the words heavy with the effort of mimicking human speech. "Yeah, that's what they all say before they trigger a core burst," Kaelen spat. He drew his phase blade. The hum of the energy edge sliced through the ambient noise of the city, a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. "You're off limits, Dust Eater. Sector 7 is for humans only. You know the protocols. You break the perimeter, you get the edge." The Lithos took a step back, its crystalline hands raised. Its fingers were long, tipped with sharp mineral points that could likely tear through a hull, yet it moved with a strange, fragile grace. "I was only seeking the medicine, the blue moss. It grows in the vents. My people, they are fading." "Fading is a nice way of saying dying," Kaelen countered, closing the distance. His pulse rate was climbing. He could feel the familiar heat of the war fever rising in his chest. "Maybe you should have thought about that before your kind blew the Greymore reactor. My brother didn't just fade. He was vaporized because of your greed for the ether." "The reactor was not our doing," the creature whispered, the amber in its eyes dimming. "Liar!" Kaelen lunged. The Lithos was fast, but Kaelen was a veteran of the vanguard. He anticipated the dodge, sweeping his blade in a low arc that forced the creature toward the dead end of a venting alley. Sparks flew as the phase blade bit into a steam pipe, releasing a cloud of scalding white vapor. The creature stumbled, its back hitting a wall of reinforced steel. It was trapped. Kaelen leveled the glowing tip of his sword at the center of its chest, right where the primary core heart would be. One thrust and the iridescent skin would shatter into 1,000 useless shards. "Give me one reason," Kaelen growled, his hand trembling with a decade of unvented rage. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't finish this right now. For Jory. For all of them." The Lithos didn't roar. It didn't lash out with its mineral claws. Instead, it reached into a small pouch at its waist. "Hands up," Kaelen screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger guard. The creature moved slowly, deliberately. It pulled out a small, jagged piece of green crystal, suspended on a simple wire of copper. It held the object out, not as a weapon, but as an offering. The sight of it hit Kaelen like a physical blow. The pattern carved into the crystal was intricate, a series of interlocking spirals that seemed to hum with a faint, internal light. It was art. It was something that required time, patience, and a soul. "My name is Zara," the creature said, its voice steadying, "and I have seen enough blood to fill the clouds of Vesper 4. If my death brings you the peace you seek, then strike. But do not think it is justice. It is only more weight for the stone." Kaelen's breath caught. The weight of the stone. He had heard that phrase in the interrogation camps. A Lithos philosophy about the burden of the living. He hated that he knew it. He hated that she had a name. "Shut up," Kaelen whispered. "Just shut up and die like a monster." He pulled the blade back, his muscles coiling for the killing blow. The world seemed to slow down. He could see the reflection of his own scarred face in the iridescent scales of her neck. He saw the fear in her amber eyes, a human fear, a raw, terrifying desperation to live. He was about to do it. He was about to become the hero the propaganda poster said he was. "Stand down, Sergeant Voss." The voice was like a hammer hitting an anvil. It wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of someone who had commanded thousands and been obeyed by every single one. Kaelen didn't lower his sword, but he froze. He knew that voice. He had heard it over the comms during the darkest nights of the Shatter War, a beacon of calm in a sea of screaming men. "Commander Thorn," Kaelen said, his eyes never leaving Zara's chest. "Sir, stay back. This one's a runner. She's dangerous. She was talking about the reactor." "I said stand down, Kaelen," the commander repeated. Commander Elias Thorn stepped into the dim light of the alley. He was a tall man, his face a map of deep-set lines and old scars. His left arm was a heavy-duty military prosthesis, finished in a dull, matte black that didn't reflect the neon. He didn't have his weapon drawn. He walked with the relaxed gait of a man who was walking into his own living room, not a potential combat zone. "Sir, she's a Lithos," Kaelen argued, his voice cracking. "They killed Jory. They destroyed everything. The protocols are clear. Illegal entry into Sector 7 is a capital offense." "The protocols were written by men who weren't there when the bridges broke," Thorn said, stopping 5 meters away. "And they were written by men who didn't owe her their lives." Kaelen's world tilted. "What?" "Lower the blade, son. That's an order." The tip of the phase blade wavered. The energy field flickered, reflecting the inner turmoil of the man holding it. For 3 years, Kaelen had lived for this moment, the moment he could finally strike back at the thing that had taken his heart. And now his idol, the greatest hero of the Lian Min, was standing in his way. "She's a monster, sir," Kaelen whispered, tears of frustration stinging his eyes behind the rebreather. "No," Thorn said softly, looking at Zara with an expression that looked hauntingly like respect. "She's the reason I'm still standing here to give you orders. Now for the last time, holster that weapon." The silence in the alley was heavy, a suffocating blanket of tension that seemed to vibrate with the hum of the city's massive anti-grav engines far above. Kaelen's arm felt like it was made of lead. The phase blade stayed leveled at Zara's throat for 5 more seconds. 5 seconds where history could have gone one way or the other, before he finally flicked the kill switch. The energy blade retracted with a sharp hiss, leaving only the cold metal hilt in his hand. "Secure your gear, Sergeant," Thorn said, his voice softening just a fraction. He stepped forward, his heavy boots clunking on the metal plating, and walked right past Kaelen. He didn't even look at the soldier. His focus was entirely on the Lithos woman. Zara hadn't moved. She was still pressed against the rusted wall, her amber eyes wide and flickering. As Thorn approached, she slowly lowered her hands, the green crystal talisman still clutched in her mineral fingers. "Commander," she vibrated. The sound was a complex chord, one that suggested relief and sorrow in equal measure. "You should not be here. The humans, they are restless tonight." "The humans are always restless, Zara," Thorn replied. He reached into the collar of his uniform and pulled out a leather cord. Hanging from it was a piece of stone, a jagged, glowing shard of green crystal. Kaelen felt the air leave his lungs. It was a perfect match to the one Zara held. If you put them together, the interlocking spirals would form a complete circle. "Sir," Kaelen's voice was barely a ghost of itself. "What is that?" Thorn turned, holding the shard up so the light of the noodle shop caught the carvings. It's called a life bond, Kaelen. In the Lithos culture, it's not just a trinket, it's a debt, a soul debt. Kaelen shook his head, his mind racing to reconcile the image of the stoic Commander Thorn with this heresy. A debt to a clinker? They're the enemy. They mined our outposts. They killed our medics. Some did, Thorn admitted, his gaze returning to Zara. Just like some of our boys burned their nurseries during the push to Greymore. War is a meat grinder, Kaelen. It doesn't care about who's right, only who's left. And 3 years ago, during the retreat through the Obsidian Flats, I was one of the ones who almost wasn't left. Kaelen remembered the story. Every recruit did. The Battle of Obsidian Flats was a massacre. A human battalion had been caught in a thermal storm and ambushed. Thorn was the only high-ranking officer to make it out. He was credited with a miraculous solo trek through 300 kilometers of toxic wasteland. The official report said you found an abandoned rover, Kaelen said, his voice trembling. The official report was a lie, Thorn said flatly. I didn't find a rover. I found a trench filled with my own men's bodies. My lung filters were blown, my leg was shattered, and the atmosphere was eating me alive. I was ready to void out. I wanted to. He gestured toward Zara. She found me. She wasn't a soldier. She was a scavenger, looking for scrap. But when she saw me, she didn't use that mineral claw to finish me off. She dragged me, 100 kilos of human in full combat gear, to a geothermal vent. She shared her own internal heat with me for 2 days. She fed me the moss that grows in the rocks to keep my heart beating. She saved the man who had ordered the shelling of her village that very morning. Zara looked down at the floor. You were hurt. The stone does not distinguish between colors when it is broken. Kaelen felt a hot, prickly sensation behind his eyes. It was anger, but it was being poisoned by something worse. Doubt. It doesn't change anything, he shouted, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. It doesn't bring Jory back. One good Lithos doesn't make up for 1,000,000 dead humans. My brother was 24 hours away from his leave. He had a girl waiting for him in the upper plates. He's gone, and all I have is a box of ash and a medal that doesn't even shine. Thorn walked over to Kaelen. He was much taller up close, a mountain of a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking anyway. He placed his massive, organic hand on Kaelen's shoulder. I know, Kaelen, Thorn said softly. I know the hole it leaves. I lost my brother at the Red Ridge. I lost my wife to the atmospheric plague. I've got enough grief to sink this entire floating city, but killing her won't fill that hole. It just digs a new one. It's not about filling a hole, Kaelen spat, though his grip on the hilt had loosened. It's about justice. Is it? Thorn asked, his eyes piercing Kaelen's soul. Or is it just about making someone else feel as bad as you do? Because that's not justice, son. That's just a cycle. And I'm tired of being part of the wheel. Thorn turned back to Zara. Go. The Peacekeeper patrols are doubling up near the docks. Take the service tunnel under Plate 4. It leads straight to the refugee camps in the low sectors. They won't look for you there. Zara hesitated, her amber eyes drifting to Kaelen. And the soldier? He will follow? Thorn looked at Kaelen. No. The soldier is going to walk me to the nearest bar and tell me everything he remembers about his brother. And then he's going to help me figure out how to stop this city from tearing itself apart. Zara nodded once, a quick, jerky movement. She looked at Kaelen one last time, not with hatred, but with a profound, soul-deep pity that hurt more than a blade. Then she vanished into the steam and the shadows of the maintenance shaft, her iridescent skin blending into the gray until she was gone. Kaelen stood there for a long time, the silence of the alley returning, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. He felt hollowed out, like a shell that had been emptied of its meat. All the rage that had fueled him for years, the fire that had kept him warm in the cold nights of the Rust Gills, had been extinguished by a single story. I hate you for this, sir, Kaelen whispered. I know, Thorn replied, his voice heavy with 1,000 years of weariness. But you'll thank me when you finally get a full night's sleep. Thorn started walking toward the mouth of the alley, toward the flickering lights of the mid-plates. Come on, Voss. Let's go find some terrible synthetic whiskey. We have a lot of work to do. Kaelen looked at the spot where Zara had been standing. He looked at the rusted wall, the copper-tasting fog, and the dark empty space where his vengeance used to be. Slowly, with shaking hands, he slid his phase blade back into its magnetic sheath. "Jory," he murmured to the air, "I don't think I'm coming home tonight." As he walked out of the alley behind the commander, the weight of his armor felt different. It didn't feel like a weapon anymore. It felt like a burden, a heavy metallic burden that he wasn't sure he wanted to carry for another 20 years. The city of Aethelgard roared above them, millions of people living their lives in the sky, unaware that in a small, dirty alleyway in the Rust Gills, a war had just ended for one man. It wasn't a glorious victory. There were no fanfares, no parades, and no medals. There was only a cold, damp wind and the realization that the monsters weren't always the ones with the glowing eyes. "Sir?" Kaelen called out as they reached the main thoroughfare. Thorn paused, his silhouette stark against the neon glow of the city. "Yeah? How do you do it?" Kaelen asked. "How do you stop being angry at the world for being broken?" Thorn looked up at the artificial sky, at the flickering lights of the upper plates where the rich lived in ignorance of the rot below. "You don't stop being angry, Kaelen," Thorn said. "You just learn to aim it at better targets. You learn that the real enemy isn't the person on the other side of the blade. It's the people who put the blade in your hand in the first place." They walked into the crowd, two soldiers lost in a sea of civilians, moving toward a future that felt as uncertain as the clouds beneath their feet. The bar was called the Iron Lung, a name that felt more like a diagnosis than an invitation. Tucked away in the damp, vibrating underbelly of the mid-plates, it was where the grease of the industrial sectors met the grit of the returning veterans. Here the air was a thick mixture of cheap synthetic tobacco, ozone from faulty wiring, and the heavy fermented scent of yeast mash. Kaelen Voss sat at a corner table, his phase blade uncoupled from his belt and resting heavily on his lap. He stared into a glass of amber liquid that claimed to be whiskey but tasted more like rocket fuel and industrial solvent. Across from him, Commander Elias Thorn leaned back in a chair that creaked under his massive frame, his mechanical arm making a soft, rhythmic whirring sound as he drummed his fingers on the scarred metal table. "Drink up, Voss," Thorn said, his voice cutting through the low thrum of the bar's ventilation. "It won't kill you. Not tonight, anyway." "I'm not thirsty, sir," Kaelen replied, his voice flat. "I'm still trying to figure out why I'm sitting in a dive bar with a traitor to the species." Thorn didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just raised his glass and took a long, slow swallow. "Traitor is a heavy word, Sergeant. It's got a lot of sharp edges. You want to be careful how you swing it." "You protected a clinker," Kaelen hissed, leaning forward. "You let a runner go. If the Internal Security Division finds out, they won't care about your medals. They'll strip you down to your subatomic particles and feed you to the scrap burners. ISD is 3 plates up, worrying about stock prices and ether crystal quotas," Thorn said dismissively. "Down here in the gills, the only thing that matters is who keeps the peace. And tonight, I kept you from doing something you'd never be able to scrub off your soul." The door to the bar hissed open, and a group of younger men walked in, wearing the faded fatigues of the local militia. They were loud, their laughter jagged and aggressive. One of them, a man with a fresh scar running across his nose, slammed a handful of credits onto the counter. "Barkeep! Around for the victors!" he shouted. "We just cleared a nest of those rock-skinned freaks out of Sector 9. Put them down like the vermin they are." The bar erupted in a low cheer. Kaelen felt the familiar heat of anger flare in his gut, but it was different now. It was confused. He looked at the militiamen, seeing the same fire in their eyes that he had carried into the alley an hour ago. He saw the pride they took in the hunt, the way they dehumanized the enemy to make the killing easier. "See that?" Thorn whispered, his gaze fixed on the young militia leader. "That's what you were 5 minutes before I stepped in. Just another kid with a blade and a hole where his heart used to be, trying to fill it with someone else's blood." "It's not the same," Kaelen argued, though his voice lacked conviction. "They're dangerous. You know what happened at Greymore. You saw the casualty reports." "I saw more than the reports, Kaelen," Thorn said, his tone turning ice cold. "I saw the reality. And the reality is that hatred is a luxury we can't afford anymore. Vesper 4 is dying. The ether is thinning. If we spend the next 20 years trying to exterminate the Lithos, there won't be enough of us left to even turn the lights off when the oxygen runs out. Thorn reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted data pad. He slid it across the table toward Kaelen. "What's this?" "A transfer," Thorn said. "You're being reassigned, effective immediately. You're no longer a shock trooper for the Vanguard. You're a peacekeeper." Kaelen stared at the pad as if it were a live grenade. A peacekeeper? Those guys are jokes. They're just glorified social workers in combat boots. They spend their time handing out rations and breaking up bar fights between humans and refugees. "They're the only ones keeping this city from turning into a slaughterhouse," Thorn countered. "And I need someone who knows the cost of war. I need someone who stood on the edge and seen the abyss. I'm forming a new unit, Kaelen. Unit 7-3. Our job is to patrol the buffer zones. We protect the refugees from the mobs, and we protect the city from the extremists on both sides." "I can't do that, sir," Kaelen said, his voice cracking. "I can't protect them. Every time I look at one of those things, I see Jory's face. I see the reactor explosion. I see the dust." "Then use that," Thorn said, leaning in close. "Use that memory. Jory didn't die so you could become a murderer in a dark alley. He died in a war that should have never happened. The best way to honor him isn't to kill more Lithos. It's to make sure no more 18-year-old kids end up as names on a memorial wall." Kaelen looked down at his phase blade. The weapon was a masterpiece of human engineering, a tool designed for one thing: the efficient separation of life from matter. He thought about the Lithos woman, Zara. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with the feral hunger the propaganda videos showed, but with a weary, ancient sadness. "She saved you," Kaelen said softly. "Why?" "Because she's a healer," Thorn said. "Even during the war, she was part of a sect that didn't take up arms. They believe that every life is a fragment of the planet's soul. To kill one is to diminish the whole. She didn't see a human commander when she found me. She saw a broken thing that needed fixing." "I don't know if I can be like that," Kaelen admitted. "I'm not asking you to be a saint, Voss," Thorn said, standing up. "I'm asking you to be a soldier, a real one. The kind that protects people who can't protect themselves, even when those people look like the things you hate. Report to the Sector 6 barracks at 8 in the morning. Don't be late. And Kaelen?" Kaelen looked up. "Leave the phase blade in your locker. Peacekeepers carry staves and shock batons. We're there to stop the bleeding, not start it." Thorn turned and walked out of the bar, his heavy footsteps fading into the chaotic noise of the mid-plates. Kaelen sat alone for a long time, the whiskey growing warm and flat in his hand. He watched the militiamen at the bar, their boasts growing louder, their stories of violence becoming more embellished with every round of drinks. He felt like a ghost. He was still in the world he knew, but the rules had changed. The enemy had a name, his commander had a secret, and his brother's death felt less like a battle cry and more like a heavy, suffocating silence. He picked up the datapad. The screen flickered to life, showing his new ID. Sergeant Kaelen Voss, Peacekeeping Unit 73. 5 years, he whispered to the empty chair across from him. 5 years of hunting, and now I'm the one guarding the gates. He stood up, his joints protesting. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the militia leader with the scarred nose. The man looked at Kaelen's Vanguard patch and nodded with a jagged grin. "Good hunting, brother," the man said, raising his glass. Kaelen didn't nod back. He didn't smile. He just kept walking, out into the copper-scented fog, toward a morning that felt 1,000 light years away. The memory didn't come in a straight line. It arrived in jagged fragments, smelling of burnt ozone and frozen iron. It was a sensory assault that Kaelen Voss could never truly escape, no matter how much synthetic whiskey he poured over his brain. 4 years ago, the Northern Rim, Vesper 4. The wind at Greymore Peak didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a high-altitude gale that carried shards of ice and volcanic ash, scouring the paint off the human transport ships and rattling the bones of the soldiers hunkered down in the trenches. "Check your seals, people!" Kaelen's voice crackled through the Cortex sync. "If you breathe this air for more than 10 seconds, your lungs will turn to crystal. Jory, keep that thermal shield focused on the wounded." "I've got it, Kaelen. Just tell the medics to hurry." Jory was 19 then. He looked even younger in his oversized combat armor, his helmet visor smeared with grime. He wasn't supposed to be on the front lines. He was a technician, a gearhead whose job was to maintain the ether extractors. But the Lithos had pushed hard through the mountain passes, and every hand that could hold a wrench or a rifle had been pressed into service. The battle wasn't like the ones in the history books. There were no grand maneuvers, no sweeping charges. It was a brutal, claustrophobic grind in the dark. The Lithos moved through the storm like ghosts, their crystalline skin refracting the muzzle flashes of the human rifles, making them look like shifting statues of light. "Contact! 6 o'clock!" Someone screamed over the comms. Kaelen spun, his phase blade igniting with a brilliant blue hum. A Lithos warrior, a massive beast nearly 3 meters tall, loomed out of the swirling snow. Its arms ended in jagged mineral blades, and its chest glowed with a rhythmic, pulsating orange light. Kaelen didn't hesitate. He dived under the creature's swing, the heat from its kinetic shield singeing the hair on his arms. He drove his blade into the creature's flank, feeling the resistance of the mineral skin before the energy edge sliced through. The Lithos let out a sound like a mountain crumbling, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the ground before it shattered into 1,000 glowing fragments. "Sergeant, the reactor!" Jory's voice was frantic now. Kaelen looked toward the Greymore reactor, a massive spire of steel and glass that sat at the center of the outpost. It was glowing a violent, unstable violet. The ether core inside was oscillating, sending ripples of distorted reality through the air. "The Lithos are trying to stabilize it," Jory shouted, his hands flying over a portable terminal. "They're not attacking it, Kaelen. They're trying to prevent a meltdown." "Don't be an idiot, Jory," Kaelen yelled, firing his pulse pistol at a shadow in the mist. "They're the ones who breached the perimeter. They want to blow the whole peak to take us with them." "No, look at the readings," Jory insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Their energy signatures are calibrated for containment, not destruction. If we don't let them finish the sequence, the core is going to fracture." But Kaelen wasn't listening. He couldn't. All he saw was the enemy. All he heard was the propaganda that had been fed to him since he was a child. The Lithos are parasites. They want the ether for themselves. They want us gone. "Vanguard, focus fire on the reactor base," Kaelen ordered. "Clear the clinkers away from the core. Protect the asset." The human soldiers opened fire. A hail of high-velocity rounds and plasma bolts slammed into the Lithos group gathered at the base of the reactor. They weren't fighting back. They were standing in a circle, their hands pressed against the vibrating glass of the containment chamber, their bodies glowing as they channeled their own internal energy into the failing machine. One by one, they fell. They shattered under the human onslaught, their crystalline remains mixing with the falling snow. "Kaelen, stop! You're killing the only ones who can save us!" Jory screamed, abandoning his terminal and running toward his brother. "Get back, Jory! That's an order!" But it was too late. The last Lithos healer, a smaller creature with skin the color of a summer sky, collapsed, its core heart extinguished by a sniper's bullet. Without their stabilizing influence, the ether core reached its breaking point. The world went silent for a heartbeat. The wind stopped. The snow hung suspended in the air. Then the violet light turned white. Kaelen was thrown backward by a wall of pure kinetic energy. His visor shattered, and the scream of the atmosphere rushing into his suit was the last thing he heard before the darkness took him. When he woke up, hours or perhaps lifetimes later, Greymore Peak was gone. In its place was a jagged crater 2 kilometers wide, glowing with the ghost light of fractured ether. He crawled through the wreckage, his suit's emergency reserves hissing. The air was a toxic graveyard of ash and pulverized stone. He searched for hours, screaming Jory's name into the void. But the only response was the whistling of the wind. He found Jory's helmet. It was half buried in a pile of gray dust. The visor was intact, but there was nothing inside. No body, no blood. Just the fine, white ash of a life that had been erased by a mistake Kaelen refused to acknowledge. He sat in the center of that crater and wept, his tears freezing on his cheeks. He told himself that the Lithos had done this. He told himself that their stabilization had been a ruse, a trick to draw the humans in before the blast. He built a fortress of hatred around his heart, stone by stone, until he couldn't see the truth anymore. Present day, Aethelgard, Kaelen bolted upright in his bunk, his chest heaving, his skin slick with cold sweat. The silence of the barracks felt like a physical weight. He looked at his hands, expecting to see the white ash of Greymore, but they were clean. He looked at the chronometer on the wall. 7:15 in the morning. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. The dream was always the same, but the ending was changing. In the old dreams, he saw the Lithos as monsters, their faces twisted in malice as they blew the reactor. But tonight, for the first time, he remembered the way they had stood in that circle. He remembered the way they hadn't fought back. He remembered the look on Jory's face. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of his own brother's blindness. "He tried to tell me," Kaelen whispered to the dark room. "He tried to tell me, and I killed him for it." The weight of the realization was almost more than he could bear. For 3 years he had been a hero of the vanguard, a man celebrated for his ferocity against the invaders. But if Jory was right, if the Lithos were trying to save the reactor, then the war wasn't a defense of humanity. It was a tragic, bloody misunderstanding fueled by the very hatred he had nurtured. He stood up and walked to his locker. He opened it and stared at his phase blade. It was a beautiful, lethal thing. It represented everything he had become since Greymore. He reached in, but he didn't grab the sword. Instead, he pulled out a long, heavy staff made of reinforced carbon fiber. It was the standard issue weapon of the Peacekeepers. It had no edge. It had no energy field. It was designed to push, to deflect, and to hold the line. He strapped the staff to his back and closed the locker. As he walked toward the mess hall, he passed a group of young recruits. They were laughing, talking about the clinker hunt the militia had conducted in Sector 9 the night before. "Hey, Sarge," one of them called out, noticing Kalen's new patch. "What's with the stick? You joining the Peace Brigade? You're too good for that trash, man. We need you on the front lines." Kaelen stopped. He looked at the recruit. A boy no older than Jory had been at Greymore. The kid had a bright, eager face and a brand new rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked like a hero. He looked like a murderer in training. "The front lines are everywhere, kid," Kaelen said, his voice low and raspy. "And sometimes the hardest battle is the one where you don't fire a single shot." The recruit blinked, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you should enjoy your breakfast," Kaelen replied, "because once you start carrying that rifle, you'll never taste anything but ash again." He left the mess hall before the boy could respond. He made his way to the Sector 6 transport hub, where the Peacekeepers gathered. The atmosphere here was different than the Vanguard barracks. There were no loud boasts, no aggressive music. It was a quiet, professional environment. Men and women of all ages, most of them veterans with gray hair and cybernetic limbs, were checking their gear and reviewing maps of the refugee zones. He saw Commander Thorne standing near a transport shuttle, talking to a Lithos woman. She wasn't Zara, but she had the same iridescent skin and amber eyes. She was wearing a Peacekeeper vest over her traditional robes, a sight that made Kalen's heart skip a beat. "Voss, you're on time," Thorne said, nodding as Kaelen approached. "Meet Officer Alara. She's our liaison for the Lithos community in the Gills. She'll be your partner for the morning shift." Kaelen looked at Alara. He felt the old instinct to reach for a blade, the old fire of Greymore licking at his heels. But then he remembered the white ash in the crater. He remembered Jory's voice. "Officer," Kaelen said, extending his hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt like lifting a mountain. Alara hesitated, her crystalline fingers twitching. She looked at Thorne, then at Kalen's vanguard scars. Slowly she reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cool, textured like polished granite, but her grip was firm. "Sergeant Voss," she vibrated. Her voice was lower than Zara's, like a cello being played in a deep cavern. "I have heard of your family name. The tragedy of Greymore is known to my people. We mourn the loss of the builders." Kaelen swallowed hard. "The builders? The ones who tried to heal the machine," Alara explained, "like your brother. We call them the Aethelgard, the Heart Friends. They knew that the energy is more important than the flags." Kaelen couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight with a grief that finally had a name. "Load up, people," Thorne shouted, slapping the side of the transport. "We've got a situation at the Sector 12 market. A group of purists are trying to block the ration trucks. I want a clean perimeter and 0 casualties. If I see a drop of blood on the pavement, you'll all be scrubbing the engine rooms for a month. Move! Kaelen climbed into the shuttle and sat across from Alara. As the engines hummed to life and the transport lifted off the plate, he looked out the window at the city of Aethelgard. It was a beautiful, precarious place, held together by ancient technology and fragile hopes. From up here, you couldn't see the rust or the blood. You could only see the lights, thousands of tiny sparks burning in the dark. He realized then that Thorn was right. Justice wasn't about the past. It wasn't about balancing the scales of blood that had already been spilled. It was about the future. It was about making sure that the light stayed on for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the weight of their stones. He gripped his staff, the carbon fiber cool against his palms. "Hey, Alara," Kaelen said as the shuttle banked toward the market district. "Yes, Sergeant? Tell me more about the Heart Friends. I think I need to know who my brother really was." The Lithos woman leaned forward, her amber eyes glowing softly in the dim light of the transport. "It is a long story, Kaelen Voss. It begins with the first stone ever pulled from the earth." As the shuttle descended into the chaotic, crowded streets of the market, Kaelen listened. He listened to the history of a people he had spent his life trying to destroy. And for the first time in 4 years, the screaming wind of Greymore Peak finally began to fade. The Sector 12 market was a chaotic tapestry of desperation and survival, hanging like a loose tooth from the southern edge of the mid-plates. Here the air didn't just smell of copper. It was a thick, choking fog of frying synthetic protein, ozone from leaking power conduits, and the unwashed scent of 10,000 people squeezed into a space built for half that number. Overhead, the massive support struts of the upper plates groaned, a constant reminder that the wealthy lived on the backs of the broken. Kaelen Voss walked beside Alara, his carbon fiber staff held loosely in both hands. He felt every gaze like a hot needle. To the humans, he was a traitor in a peacekeeper vest, a vanguard hero who had traded his pride for a stick. To the Lithos refugees huddling in the shadows of the vendor stalls, he was just another armored ghost of the war, a reminder of the soldiers who had shattered their homes. "Stay sharp, Voss," Thorn's voice crackled through the Cortex sync. "The agitators are active today. We're getting reports of a group calling themselves the Purists. They've been handing out inflammatory data slates near the ration centers. They want to fight." "Copy that, Commander," Kaelen muttered. He glanced at Alara. Her skin was a subdued matte gray today, a sign of high stress among her kind. "You okay, officer?" "The air is heavy with discord, Sergeant," Alara replied, her voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in Kaelen's chest. "My people can feel the oscillation of the crowd. It is like a tremor before a mountain fall. The anger, it has no target, so it searches for one." "Just another Tuesday in the gills," Kaelen said, trying to sound casual, but his hand tightened on the staff. They passed a vendor selling refurbished air filters. A group of men stood nearby, wearing red armbands, the symbol of the Purists. Their leader was a man Kaelen recognized. Barrett, a former supply sergeant who had spent the war counting crates in a bunker, while Joy was dying on a ridge. Barrett was standing on a plastic crate, shouting to a gathering crowd. "Look at them!" Barrett roared, pointing a trembling finger at a group of Lithos families waiting in the ration line. "They come to our city, they take our oxygen, they take our food, and they pay us in dust. Who built Aethelgard? Was it the Rockheads? No, it was human sweat. And now the Council wants us to share our beds with the monsters who blew the Greymore reactor." The crowd let out a low, ugly growl. Kaelen felt the temperature in the market rise. "Barrett, stow it," Kaelen called out, stepping forward. "You're violating the Public Assembly Ordinance. Pack up your crate and move along before I have to cite you." Barrett looked down at Kaelen, a sneer twisting his face. "Well, if it isn't Voss, the hero of the Vanguard. I heard you traded your balls for a peacekeeper badge. How does it feel, Kaelen? Does the clinker lover Thorn give you a treat every time you bark for him?" "He's not worth the paperwork, Voss," Alara whispered, though her skin was beginning to flicker with dangerous, jagged pulses of orange light. "I'm not barking, Barrett," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "I'm telling you to de-escalate, now." "Or what?" Barrett jumped down from the crate, his cronies closing in behind him. They were armed with heavy wrenches and improvised clubs. You going to poke me with your walking stick? We're tired of waiting for the council to do their jobs. If they won't clean up the gills, we will. At that moment, a small Lithos child, perhaps no older than 5 cycles, tripped while running toward its mother. The child bumped into Barrett's leg. The contact was harmless, a soft clink of mineral skin against heavy fabric. But to a man looking for a reason to hate, it was an assault. "Get off me, you freak!" Barrett snarled, his boot swinging in a vicious arc. He kicked the child squarely in the chest, sending the small creature sprawling across the metal deck. The child didn't cry. Lithos didn't have tear ducts. Instead, it emitted a high-pitched harmonic shriek of pure pain that sliced through the noise of the market like a razor. The reaction was instantaneous. The Lithos refugees surged forward, their peaceful posture replaced by a defensive wall of shimmering crystalline bodies. The humans, egged on by the purists, roared back, pulling weapons from their belts. "Hold the line!" Kaelen shouted, his staff igniting with a dull, blue kinetic field. He stepped between Barrett and the child's mother, who was scrambling to reach her young. "Get out of the way, Voss!" Barrett screamed, raising a heavy iron pipe. "This is our city!" He swung. Kaelen didn't use his blade. He didn't use his training to kill. He used the staff to catch the pipe, the kinetic energy absorbing the blow with a heavy thud. He twisted the staff, using Barrett's own momentum to send the man stumbling back into his friends. "Ilara, get the civilians out of here," Kaelen ordered. "I cannot leave you, Sergeant." She vibrated, her skin now a brilliant, terrifying crimson. She wasn't fighting, but her presence was a beacon. She stood over the fallen child, her arms spread wide, creating a shimmering kinetic shield that deflected the stones and scrap metal being thrown by the mob. "Move them now!" Kaelen roared. The market turned into a blur of violence. Kaelen was a whirlwind of controlled motion. He pushed, he parried, he blocked. He saw faces he knew, men he had served with, neighbors from the mid-plates, their features distorted by a blind, unthinking rage. They weren't fighting for a cause, they were fighting because it was easier to be angry than to be afraid. A heavy wrench caught Kaelen in the ribs, cracking a bone. He gasped, falling to one knee. Barrett was over him in a heartbeat, the iron pipe raised for a killing blow. "Die, you traitor!" Kaelen looked up. He could have reached for his emergency knife. He could have ended Barrett's life in a second. But then he saw the Lithos child. The child was being carried away by its mother, but it was looking back at Kaelen. Its amber eyes weren't filled with hate. They were filled with confusion. It didn't understand why the world was trying to break it. Kaelen didn't reach for the knife. He raised his staff, not to strike, but to block. Clang! The pipe hit the staff, sending a vibration through Kaelen's teeth. But Barrett didn't get a second swing. A massive, matte black mechanical hand clamped onto the pipe and crushed it like it was made of tin. Commander Thorne stood there, his face a mask of cold, surgical fury. He didn't say a word. He simply shoved Barrett back with enough force to send him flying 10 meters into a pile of empty shipping crates. Thorne turned to the crowd, his external speakers booming with a volume that rattled the very floor plates of the sector. "Enough!" The word carried the weight of a thunderclap. The mob froze. The soldiers, the workers, the refugees, everyone stopped. "Look at yourselves," Thorne said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the market. "You're fighting over crumbs while the ship is sinking. You want to be angry at the Lithos? Fine. You want to be angry at the peacekeepers? Fine. But you do not touch a child in my city, not while I am still breathing." He looked at the purists, his mechanical arm whirring as it recalibrated. "Barrett, if I see you in this sector again, I won't sight you. I'll throw you off the edge myself. Do you understand me?" Barrett scrambled to his feet, blood leaking from a cut on his forehead. He looked at the crowd, searching for support, but the fire had gone out. The sight of the commander, the hero of the Obsidian Flats, standing in defense of the enemy, had broken the spell. The purists slunk away into the shadows. The crowd began to disperse, the tension draining away, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the struts. Kaelen groaned, clutching his side. Thorne reached down and pulled him to his feet with a strength that was both terrifying and comforting. "You okay, Voss?" "I've been better, sir," Kaelen wheezed. "Ribs definitely busted." "You did good," Thorne said, looking at the staff in Kaelen's hand. You didn't draw blood. You held the line. It felt harder than the war, sir, Kaelen admitted. Killing them would have been easy. Standing there and letting them hit me, that was the hard part. That's why you're a peacekeeper, Thorn said. Anyone can be a wolf, Kaelen. It takes a man to be a shield. Alara approached them, her skin fading back to a soft, contemplative lavender. She knelt beside Kaelen and placed a cool, crystalline hand over his fractured ribs. Kaelen flinched instinctively, but then he felt it, a wave of soothing, harmonic resonance that seemed to dull the pain instantly. The bone is not displaced, she vibrated softly. It will knit in 2 days with the help of the resonance. Thanks, Kaelen said, his voice raspy. As they walked away from the market, Kaelen looked back. The Lithos mother and her child were gone, but a small green crystal talisman lay on the deck where they had been. He picked it up. It was simple, uncarved, but it felt warm in his hand. He realized then that the cost of the lesson wasn't just physical pain. It was the realization that his old life was truly dead. He couldn't go back to being the man who saw the world in black and white. He was in the gray now, and the gray was a heavy place to be. Thorn, Kaelen said as they reached the transport. The riot wasn't just spontaneous. Barrett was using talking points, specifically about the Greymore reactor. He had details that haven't been released to the public. He knew the exact time of the breach. Thorn's eyes narrowed. I noticed that too. Someone is feeding them information. Someone who wants the gills to burn. Core Corp? Kaelen asked. Most likely, Thorn said, his face tightening. The ether quotas are down, and the council is talking about a peace treaty. Core Corp doesn't want peace. Peace means they have to pay for the ether, instead of just taking it. If they can start a race war, they can justify a military takeover of the Lithos territories. So the riot was a distraction, Kaelen said, the pieces clicking into place. A distraction for what? Alara asked. For whatever they're doing in the deep vents, Thorn said. I've been tracking a series of unscheduled power draws from the lower levels. Something big is happening down there, Voss, and I think it's time we found out what it is. The deep vents were a place where the sun never reached. Located at the very base of Aethelgard, just above the massive fusion thrusters that kept the city airborne, it was a forest of pipes, steam valves, and humming turbines. It was the lungs and the bowels of the city, and it was the perfect place for secrets to hide. Kaelen, Alara, and Thorn moved through the humid darkness, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of grime on the floor. Kaelen's ribs still ached, but the Lithos resonance had turned the sharp agony into a dull, manageable thrum. He carried a high-intensity torch, its beam cutting through the swirling steam like a blade. The power signatures are coming from sub-level 48, Alara whispered. Her skin was a dull, camouflaged gray, allowing her to nearly vanish against the industrial backdrop. It is an abandoned sector. It was supposed to have been sealed after the Great Leak 20 years ago. Nothing is ever truly abandoned in Aethelgard, Thorn grunted, his mechanical arm whirring as he cleared a path through a tangle of rusted cables. If there's power, there's a purpose. They reached a heavy blast door, its surface scorched by ancient fires. A small, modern electronic lock had been grafted onto the rusted metal, a clear sign of recent activity. Core Corp encryption, Kaelen noted, examining the interface. I can bypass it, but it'll trigger a silent alarm at their headquarters. Do it, Thorn ordered. We're already past the point of being polite. Kaelen pulled a small hacking tool from his belt, a device he had kept from his Vanguard days. He bypassed the security protocols with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years breaking into enemy bunkers. The lock turned green, and with a heavy groan of protesting metal, the door slid open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the filth of the gills. It was a high-tech laboratory filled with rows of glowing server banks and experimental ether chambers. In the center of the room sat a massive, crystalline structure, a Lithos core heart, but it was wrong. It wasn't glowing with the warm, shifting colors of a living being. It was a sickly, pulsating violet, identical to the light Kaelen had seen at the Greymore reactor. Great ancestors, Alara whispered, her voice trembling with a dissonant vibration. They are fracturing it. This is a core seed. It is how we bring new life to our people. They have stolen a sacred vessel and turned it into a weapon. It's more than a weapon, Thorne said, walking toward a computer terminal. Look at these readings. They're not just fracturing the core. They're using it to broadcast a signal, a low-frequency harmonic wave. Kaelen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A harmonic wave? What for? To trigger the Lithos, Alara said, her eyes wide with horror. Our biology is based on resonance. A wave at this frequency doesn't just hurt us. It bypasses our higher functions. It triggers our primal defense mechanisms. It makes us violent. It turns us into the monsters the humans think we are. So the riot in the market, Kaelen realized. The purists started it, but this machine ensured the Lithos would fight back with maximum aggression. It wasn't a riot, it was a field test. It gets worse, Thorne said, his voice tight with rage. He was scrolling through a series of encrypted files. I've found the Greymore manifest. Voss, look at this. Kaelen stepped up to the screen. His eyes scanned the lines of code, the logistical data, and the casualty lists. He saw his own name. He saw Jory's. And then he saw the order. Operation Cinderfall. Objective: induce reactor instability to justify emergency annexation of northern ether fields. Note: all local personnel are considered expendable. Communication jammers to be activated at 0300 hours. Kaelen's knees went weak. He had to grab the edge of the terminal to keep from falling. They did it on purpose, Kaelen whispered. The words felt like they were made of glass, cutting his throat as they came out. The Lithos in the circle, they were trying to stop the sequence that CoreCorp had already started. We were shooting at the people who were trying to save us. And Jory, Thorne said, his hand resting on Kaelen's shoulder. Jory knew. He saw the readings. That's why they made sure the jammers were on. They couldn't let him tell anyone. The weight of 4 years of hatred crashed down on Kaelen. Every Lithos he had killed, every clinker he had cursed, every night he had spent praying for revenge. It had all been a lie. He hadn't been a hero. He had been a puppet for a corporation that had murdered his brother for a percentage of a profit margin. He looked at the violet core in the center of the room. It was humming now, the frequency rising. We have to shut it down, Kaelen said, his voice hollow. It's a trap, Voss, Thorne warned, but he was too late. A section of the wall slid open, and a squad of CoreCorp security guards stepped out, their heavy pulse rifles aimed at the trio. In the center of the squad stood a man in a pristine, gray suit, Marcus Vane, the chief of security for CoreCorp. Commander Thorne, Vane said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. I must say I'm impressed. We expected the sergeant to find his way here eventually, but we thought you'd be too busy playing diplomat to notice the power draws. Vane, Thorne growled, you're going to hang for this. The Council won't ignore a direct violation of the Sovereignty Act. The Council is on our payroll, Commander, Vane said with a thin smile. And by tomorrow morning, the Lithos refugees will have attacked this facility and destroyed it, along with any evidence of our research. It's a tragedy, really. 2 war heroes and a refugee liaison, dead in the line of duty. Vane looked at Kaelen. And you, Sergeant, you should have stayed in the vanguard. You were so much easier to manage when you were angry. Kaelen looked at the guards. He looked at the violet core. He felt the old fire rising, but it wasn't the blind, destructive fire of Greymore. It was something else. It was cold. It was focused. It was justice. I'm still angry, Vane, Kaelen said, his hand moving slowly to the hilt of the phase blade he had hidden in the small of his back. I'm just angry at the right people now. Kill them, Vane ordered, stepping back. The guards opened fire. The room exploded into a chaos of blue and red light. Thorne moved with a speed that defied his age, his mechanical arm unfolding into a heavy riot shield that deflected the first volley. Alara dropped to the floor, her skin turning a brilliant, blinding white that acted as a flashbang, disorienting the attackers. Kaelen didn't go for the guards. He lunged for the server banks. Voss, get the data! Thorne shouted over the roar of the pulse rifles. Kaelen dived behind a server rack, bullets whistling over his head. He pulled a portable drive from his belt and slammed it into the terminal. Downloading, he muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard. 20%, the screen flashed. A guard charged Kaelen, swinging the butt of his rifle. Kaelen ducked, swept the man's legs with his staff, and then, For the first time in years, he drew his phase blade. He didn't kill the man. He sliced through the rifle's power cell, rendering the weapon useless, and then delivered a punch that sent the guard into unconsciousness. 40%. The violet core was glowing brighter now, the harmonic wave becoming a physical pressure in Kaelen's ears. Elara was screaming, a high, dissonant sound of agony. The frequency was tearing her apart. "Thorn! The core is going critical!" Kaelen yelled. "I'll handle the core! Get that data and get out of here!" Thorn roared. He charged the crystalline heart, his mechanical arm glowing as he prepared to deliver a kinetic burst to shatter the containment field. 60%! Vayne was shouting orders, trying to rally his guards. "Don't let them reach the core. If it fractures, the whole sector goes." Kaelen saw a guard aiming at Thorn's back. "No!" Kaelen threw his staff like a javelin. It caught the guard in the chest, the kinetic impact throwing the man back. But the distraction cost Kaelen. A pulse round grazed his shoulder, throwing him against the terminal. 80%. The room was vibrating now, pieces of the ceiling falling as the harmonic wave reached its peak. The violet light was blinding. Kaelen could feel his own teeth rattling. 100%. Transfer complete. Kaelen grabbed the drive and looked at Thorn. The commander was at the core, his hand buried in the violet energy. His face was contorted in pain, his mechanical arm throwing off sparks as it struggled to contain the feedback. "Go, Kaelen!" Thorn screamed. "Get Elara and go! Tell the city! Tell them the truth!" "I'm not leaving you, sir." "That's an order, Sergeant. Save the living. Honor the dead." Thorn let out a roar of pure, unadulterated strength. He drove his mechanical fist into the center of the violet core. The world turned white. The explosion wasn't a blast of fire. It was a wave of pure, crystalline energy. Kaelen was thrown toward the exit, his hand gripping Elara's arm. He felt the floor give way beneath them. They fell into the darkness of the lower vents just as the laboratory above them vanished in a silent, violet flash. Kaelen woke up in the dark. The only sound was the drip of water and the distant hum of the city's engines. His body felt like it had been put through a trash compactor, and his shoulder was a map of fire. "Elara," he croaked. "I am here," a faint vibration replied. He found her a few meters away. Her skin was dull, almost translucent, but she was alive. Kaelen reached into his pocket and felt the data drive. It was still there. The proof. The truth about Jory, the truth about the war, the truth about the monsters. He looked up toward the vents. They were deep in the guts of the city, and the Core Corp hunters would be coming for them soon. But for the first time in 4 years, Kaelen didn't feel like a victim. He didn't feel like a puppet. He felt like a man with a purpose. He looked at the drive, then at the iridescent Lithos woman beside him. "We're going to finish this," Kaelen said, his voice steady. "For Jory, for Thorn, for everyone who's tired of carrying the stone." He stood up, his legs shaking but holding. He offered his hand to Elara. "Can you walk?" She took his hand, her crystalline fingers cold but strong. "I will walk until the stars go out, Kaelen Voss." They started moving through the darkness, two ghosts of a war that was finally, truly about to begin. The darkness of the deep vents was not an absence of light, but a presence of weight. It felt like the millions of tons of steel and stone that made up Aethelgard were pressing down on Kaelen's very soul. He moved with a practiced, predatory quiet, one hand supporting Elara as she stumbled through the knee-deep cooling fluid that flooded the service tunnels. The fluid was a stagnant, oily green, smelling of chemical rot and ancient rust. "We have to stop," Elara vibrated, her voice a fractured chord that made Kaelen's teeth ache. Her skin, usually a vibrant tapestry of iridescent scales, was now a dull, bruised charcoal. "The resonance, it has cracked my primary core. I am losing my internal heat." Kaelen looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see an enemy or a liaison. He saw a person who was dying because of a war she hadn't started. He saw Jory's face in the way her eyes clouded with pain. "Just a bit further," Kaelen whispered, pulling her into a dry alcove behind a massive humming turbine. "We're near the static. If we can reach the hub, I know someone who can help." "A friend?" she asked, her breathing a series of sharp, clicking sounds. "No," Kaelen said, his mouth twisting into a bitter smile. Someone I put in prison 2 years ago, a data thief named Vax. He's the only one in this city with a transmitter powerful enough to bypass Core Corp's firewalls. He sat her down against the warm metal of the turbine. He pulled a thermal blanket from his pack, a leftover piece of Vanguard gear, and wrapped it around her crystalline shoulders. It was a strange sight, the elite soldier of the human alliance tending to the broken body of a Lithos. If his old squad could see him now, they'd call it a terminal case of cortex fry. They'd say he'd gone soft, that the dust eaters had finally gotten to his head. Kaelen checked his wrist terminal. The city was in a state of total blackout. Above them, in the mid-plates and the gills, the sirens were screaming. Core Corp had declared martial law. The official broadcast was already playing on a loop. Terrorist attack in the deep vents. Commander Thorne and Sergeant Voss confirmed KIA. Lithos insurgents responsible for the destruction of Level 48. "They've already killed us, Ilara," Kaelen said, his voice hollow. "On every screen in Aethelgard, we're just another pair of ghosts." "Then we have nothing left to lose," she replied, her amber eyes flickering back to life for a moment. "That is a dangerous state for a person to be in. Yeah, let's go make it their problem." They reached the entrance to the static 20 minutes later. It was a hidden crawl space beneath a massive waste reclamation plant, shielded by layers of lead and electromagnetic dampeners. Kaelen punched a complex code into a keypad hidden behind a rusted valve. The wall slid open with a screech of unlubricated metal. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of hot circuits. Dozens of monitors flickered on every surface, casting a pale, ghostly light over a man who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in a decade. Vax was thin, his skin a sallow yellow, his eyes covered by a pair of multi-lens optical implants. "Voss," Vax said, not looking up from his keyboard. "I thought you were dead. The news says you were vaporized by a Lithos suicide bomber. I was almost going to pour a drink in your honor." "Almost. News is a lie, Vax. You of all people should know that," Kaelen said, stepping into the room and helping Ilara into a chair. Vax finally looked up, his optical lenses clicking as they zoomed in on Ilara. He recoiled, his chair rolling back. "What the hell is that doing here? Are you crazy, Voss? Bringing a clinker into my hub? If the purists find out, they'll burn this whole block down." "She's not a that, Vax. Her name is Ilara, and she's the only reason I'm still breathing," Kaelen said, his hand resting on his peacekeeper staff. He didn't use the tone of a soldier giving an order. He used the tone of a man who was asking for mercy. "I need your help. Not for me. For the city." "Help? You threw me into the black hole for 6 months for selling encrypted codes," Vax barked, his voice rising in pitch. "You broke my hand during the arrest, remember? I still can't type as fast as I used to." Kaelen looked at the man's scarred hand. He remembered that night. He had been so full of self-righteous fury, so convinced that the law was the only thing standing between civilization and the void. He had treated everyone like an enemy because it was easier than looking at them as people. "I remember," Kaelen said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the data drive. He set it on the table between them. "I'm sorry, Vax. I was a different man then. I was a soldier who thought he was a hero. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I'm right about this." Vax hesitated, his optical lenses whirring. He looked at the drive, then at Kaelen's tired, scarred face. "What's on it?" "The truth about Greymore, the truth about why Jory died, and proof that Core Corp is using a resonance weapon to turn the Lithos into a mob so they can annex the northern territories." Vax's expression shifted. The cynicism didn't disappear, but it was joined by a flicker of professional curiosity. He took the drive and plugged it into a terminal. Within seconds, his screens were flooded with scrolling lines of code, blueprints, and classified memos. "Sweet mother of the stars," Vax whispered. "This isn't just a corporate scandal. This is a genocide manual." "Can you broadcast it?" Kaelen asked. "Not just to a few terminals. I want it on every screen, every data slate, every billboard from the spire to the gills. I want the people to see what their tax credits are paying for." "Core Corp has the main array locked down with a triple-layer encryption," Vax said, his fingers beginning to fly across the keys with a frantic energy. "I can't do it from here. I can build the bridge, But I need someone to physically tap into the primary transmitter at the Spire's communication hub. And that place is crawling with Slayers. Slayers! Core Corp's elite private security. Men who were more machine than human, programmed for one thing, the elimination of threats to the bottom line. I'll go, Kaelen said. You're one man with a stick, Voss, Vax said, glancing at the Peacekeeper staff. They have pulse rifles and kinetic shields. I have something they don't, Kaelen said, looking at Alara. She stood up, her skin shimmering with a faint, determined light. You have the resonance. I cannot fight, Kaelen, but I can shield you. If we are close, I can use my internal core to create a localized dampening field. Their pulse rounds will lose 50% of their velocity before they hit you. It'll kill you, Alara, Kaelen said. Your core is already fractured. Using that much energy, you'll shatter. I am already a ghost, Sergeant, she vibrated, her voice steady. But if my shards can light the way to the truth, then I will be the most beautiful light Aethelgard has ever seen. Kaelen felt a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow. He had spent years thinking he was the one making the sacrifices. He had thought his grief made him special. But here was the enemy, offering her life to save a city that hated her. Okay, Kaelen said, his voice thick. Vax, get the bridge ready. As soon as I tap the transmitter, you send it. Don't wait for a signal. Just dump it all. Voss, Vax called out as Kaelen reached the door. If you make it back, I might forgive you for the hand. I'll take those odds, Kaelen replied. They stepped back out into the vents, the humid air pressing against them. Kaelen looked at Alara, and for the first time, he didn't feel the weight of the stone. He felt the light of it. Let's go show them who the monsters are, he said. They began the long climb toward the spire. Every step was a battle. They moved through the service shafts, avoiding the main elevators. Twice they had to hide as Slayer kill teams swept through the corridors, their red optical sensors searching the shadows for any sign of life. Kaelen's heart pounded against his cracked ribs, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the focus. He was no longer the man who wanted to avenge his brother. He was the man who wanted to finish his brother's work. They are coming, Alara whispered as they reached the final maintenance hatch leading to the communication hub. I can feel the static of their neural links. 3 of them. Behind the door. Kaelen gripped his staff. He didn't reach for the phase blade. He didn't want to kill anymore. He wanted to stop the killing. Stay behind me, Alara. Keep the shield tight. He kicked the door open. The room was a cathedral of glass and chrome, dominated by the massive glowing pillar of the primary transmitter. 3 Slayers stood in front of it, their matte black armor looking like something out of a nightmare. They didn't speak. They didn't offer a warning. They simply raised their pulse rifles and fired. The blue bolts of energy streaked through the air, but as they reached a meter from Kaelen, they slowed. A shimmering, iridescent dome appeared around him and Alara, the air vibrating with a high-pitched harmonic hum. The bolts sizzled and died against the shield. Now! Alara cried out, her skin turning a blinding, painful white. Kaelen lunged. He was a blur of motion. He didn't aim for the Slayers' heads or hearts. He aimed for their joints, their weapons, and their power cells. He used the staff to deflect a rifle barrel, then delivered a kinetic burst that shorted out a Slayer's armor servos. He was fighting for his life, but he was also fighting for theirs. He saw the men behind the masks, brainwashed, programmed, but still human. He didn't want to add their names to the memorial wall. He reached the transmitter. He slammed the data link into the primary port. Vax, now, he screamed. The monitors in the room flickered. The data began to flow. Outside, through the massive glass windows of the spire, Kaelen could see the city. One by one, the giant holographic billboards that usually showed perfume ads and stock prices began to change. The image of the Greymore reactor appeared. The secret orders. The footage of the Lithos healers standing in the circle, trying to save the world. The audio of Marcus Vane ordering the execution of Thorn and Voss. The truth was out, but the battle wasn't over. The 3rd Slayer, the leader of the squad, managed to bypass the dampening field. He dropped his rifle and drew a vibroblade, lunging at Alara. No! Kaelen roared. He threw himself between them. The blade caught him in the side, slicing through his armor and into his flesh. Kaelen gasped, the world spinning. He fell to his knees, his hand clutching the wound. The Slayer raised the blade for the finishing strike, but he didn't bring it down. He stood there, his blade shaking. The man behind the helmet was looking at the screens. He was looking at the footage of Greymore. He was looking at the proof that he had been fighting for a lie. We were the ones, the Slayer whispered, his voice distorted by his suit's speakers. It wasn't them. It was us. He dropped the blade. It clattered on the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the room. The other two Slayers, their armor sparking and damaged, stood up slowly. They didn't reach for their weapons. They just looked at the screens, their shoulders slumping under the weight of a realization that was too heavy for any man to carry. Kaelen looked at Alara. She had collapsed, her skin so pale it was almost transparent. Her core heart was dimming, the light flickering like a candle in a gale. Alara, Kaelen whispered, crawling toward her. We did it. They saw. Everyone saw. She looked at him, a small, sad smile touching her lips. I can hear the song of the city, Kaelen. The dissonance is fading. The stones are quiet. Don't go, Kaelen said, his voice breaking. Please. I just found a friend. I can't lose you too. You haven't lost me, she vibrated, her hand reaching out to touch his face. Her skin was cold, but the touch was the gentlest thing Kaelen had ever felt. I am just returning to the earth. Remember the weight, Kaelen. Remember to carry it well. Her eyes dimmed. Her skin turned to gray stone. With a final soft sigh of escaping air, Alara, the healer who had saved the man who wanted to kill her, shattered into 1,000 tiny, iridescent shards. Kaelen sat there in the middle of the spire, surrounded by the wreckage of a war and the proof of a tragedy. He held a handful of her shards in his palm, their light fading into the gray dawn. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, a broken soldier in a broken city, finally realizing that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting. It was the living that came after. The aftermath of the broadcast was not a sudden peace, but a violent, stuttering transformation. Aethelgard did not wake up and decide to be kind. It woke up and realized it had been betrayed. In the Guilds, the riots didn't stop, but the targets changed. The crowds that had been hunting Lithos turned their fury toward the Corp offices. The purists found themselves surrounded not by enemies, but by neighbors demanding to know why they had believed the lies. Kaelen stood on the balcony of the communication hub, looking down at the city. His side was bandaged with a makeshift wrap of Slayer mesh, the blood seeping through in a dark, persistent stain. Beside him stood the 3 Slayers who had tried to kill him. They hadn't left. They hadn't been arrested. They were just standing there, their helmets removed, revealing 3 young men who looked like they were barely out of their teens. What do we do now, Sergeant? One of them asked. His name was Miller. He had a shock of blonde hair and a scar through his eyebrow. He looked hauntingly like a version of Jory that had lived to grow bitter. We do our jobs, Kaelen said, his voice raspy and tired. We keep the peace. We make sure the city doesn't tear itself apart before the council can be dismantled. But they'll come for us, Miller said, looking at the smoke rising from the lower levels. The board of directors, they have other assets, other squads. Let them come, Kaelen said, gripping his staff. The truth is a frequency you can't unhear, Miller. Once the people know they've been played, the game is over. Corp isn't a government, it's a parasite, and the host is finally fighting back. A transport shuttle banked toward the spire, its markings not of Corp, but of the city militia. It landed with a heavy thud on the platform. The doors hissed open, and a group of soldiers stepped out, led by a man Kaelen never thought he'd see again. Commander Thorn. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found it wanting. His armor was scorched, his mechanical arm was missing from the elbow down, and his face was covered in a layer of fine violet ash. But he was standing, and he was smiling. Voss, Thorn said, his voice like gravel. I see you didn't wait for me to start the party. Sir, Kaelen felt a surge of hope that almost made him forget the hole in his side. How did you... The lab, the explosion... I'm a hard man to kill, Kaelen, especially when I'm too stubborn to die, Thorn said, stepping onto the platform. He looked at the 3 Slayers, then at Kaelen's bandages. I saw the broadcast. I saw the data. You did it, son. You really did it. Alara didn't make it, sir, Kaelen said, his voice dropping. He held out his hand, showing the few remaining shards of her skin. Thorn's expression softened. He took one of the shards, his eyes misting over. She was a heart friend. She knew the cost. She didn't die for a flag, Kaelen. She died for a future where flags don't matter as much as the people standing under them. Thorn turned to the militia soldiers. Secure the hub. Arrest any Core Corp personnel who resist, and tell the hospitals to open their doors to everyone. Human, Lithos, it doesn't matter. If they're bleeding, they get a bed. Yes, sir. Thorn turned back to Kaelen. The council has collapsed. Half the members are in custody, and the other half are trying to flee the city. We have a provisional government forming in the mid-plates. They want us to lead the security transition. Us, sir? Kaelen asked. The peacekeepers, Thorn said. People who know that the real strength isn't in the blade, but in the restraint. I'm making you the head of the new integration unit, Kaelen. Your job is to go into the guilds and make sure the Lithos refugees aren't just tolerated, but protected. I don't know if I'm the right man for that, sir. I've spent too much time being the monster they're afraid of. That's exactly why you're the right man, Thorn said, placing his remaining hand on Kaelen's shoulder. Because you know what the monster looks like. You know how it thinks, and you know how to choose differently. Kaelen looked out at the city. The sun was finally beginning to break through the chemical fog of the gills, casting a long golden light over the rusted plates of Aethelgard. For the first time in 4 years, the air didn't taste of copper. It tasted of possibility. There's a kid, Kaelen said suddenly. A Lithos child. I saw him in the market. His mother was wearing a green talisman. I want to find them. I want to tell them that it's over. Then go, Thorn said. That's your first mission, Sergeant. Find the people you almost hurt and show them that the world has changed. Kaelen nodded. He looked at Miller and the other 2 slayers. You 3, you're with me. You want to see what real justice looks like? It starts with a conversation, not a firefight. Miller hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Sergeant. They boarded the transport and descended into the city. As they flew over the mid-plates, Kaelen saw something that made him stop breathing for a moment. On a rooftop in a residential sector, a human woman was helping a Lithos elder clear debris from a fallen strut. They weren't talking. They weren't hugging. They were just working together, 2 people trying to fix a home that belonged to both of them. It was a small thing, a tiny, insignificant act in a city of millions. But to Kaelen, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They reached the Sector 12 market an hour later. The area was still a mess of overturned stalls and shattered glass, but the violence had subsided. People were standing in groups, talking in low, hushed tones. The fear was still there, but the hatred had been replaced by a profound, shell-shocked confusion. Kaelen walked through the market, his peacekeeper staff on his back. He looked for the woman with the green talisman. He searched the ration lines, the medical tents, and the shadows of the vents. He found her in the ruins of the noodle shop where he had first seen the child. She was sitting on a plastic crate, holding the boy in her lap. The boy was asleep, his crystalline skin reflecting the afternoon light. Kaelen stopped 5 meters away. He didn't move closer. He didn't want to scare her. The woman looked up. She recognized him instantly. Her skin flickered with a brief pulse of defensive red, but then it faded to a wary, exhausted gray. You, she vibrated. The soldier with the stick. My name is Kaelen, he said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, uncarved green crystal he had found in the market after the riot. He held it out on his palm. I believe this belongs to you. The woman stared at the crystal. She looked at Kaelen's bandaged side, at his tired eyes, and at the 3 slayers standing behind him, with their heads bowed. Slowly, she stood up. She walked toward him, her movements cautious but no longer frantic. She took the crystal from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his skin. Cool, hard, and unmistakably alive. My son. He asked why you did it, she said, her voice a low, beautiful melody. Why you stood in front of the iron pipe. Because I was tired of people getting hurt, Kaelen said, and because my brother would have done the same thing. The woman looked at the crystal, then back at Kaelen. She reached into her robes and pulled out a small, carved figure, the same kind of art Zara had shown him in the alley. It was a depiction of a bird with its wings spread wide, carved from a single piece of etherstone. "This is a solavin," she said, "a bringer of light. We give them to those who have seen the darkness and chosen to turn back." She pressed the figure into Kaelen's hand. "Thank you, Kaelen Voss, for the light." Kaelen looked at the small stone bird. It felt warm in his hand, a solid physical weight that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. He looked at the boy who had woken up and was staring at him with wide amber eyes. Kaelen offered a small, tentative smile. The boy didn't smile back. Lithos didn't have the facial muscles for it, but his skin shimmered with a soft, comforting blue. "We have a lot of work to do," Kaelen said to the woman. "The city, it's going to be difficult for a while. There will be people who still want to fight. People who haven't heard the truth yet. Then we will tell them together," she replied. Kaelen stood in the middle of the market, the sun setting over the floating city of Aethelgard. He was a Ku-bin, a peacekeeper, a brother, and a friend. He was a man who had been built for war, but who was finally learning how to live for peace. He thought about Jory. He thought about the white ash of Greymore. He realized that his brother hadn't died for a cause or a corporation. He had died for a moment like this, a moment where two people could stand in a ruined market and see each other not as enemies, but as fellow survivors. The weight of the stone was still there. It would always be there. But as Kaelen walked through the crowd, helping a vendor upright a fallen table, he realized that he didn't have to carry it alone. And that made all the difference. The silence that followed the fall of Corcorp was not the peaceful quiet of a summer morning. It was the heavy, expectant hush that follows a massive structural collapse. Aethelgard was a city that had been held together by the tension of a common enemy, and with that tension snapped, the entire social architecture was swaying in the wind. Kaelen Voss sat on a high-backed chair in a medical recovery ward in the mid-plates. The room was sterile, smelling of antiseptic and the sharp metallic tang of filtered oxygen. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a tapestry of smoke and light. In the 3 days since the broadcast, the Shatter War had finally been brought home, not as a conflict of flags, but as a reckoning of conscience. "Stop squirming, Sergeant," the medic said, her voice tired but firm. She was a human woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many casualty cycles. She was currently adjusting the bioweave over the deep laceration in Kaelen's side. "If you pop those seals, I'm not wasting more synthetic skin on you. We're running low as it is." "I've had worse, Doc," Kaelen grunted, wincing as the bioweave hummed, knitting his flesh back together. "At least this one didn't come from a mineral claw." "No, it came from a human-made vibroblade," she countered, pinning a fresh sensor to his chest. "Which makes it a lot harder to explain to the recruits, doesn't it?" Kaelen didn't answer. He looked at the data slate on the bedside table. The headlines were a blur of chaos. Interim council formed. Core Corp assets seized. Massive protests in the Spire. First joint human Lithos relief convoy reaches the gills. The door hissed open, and Commander Thorne walked in. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. His left sleeve was pinned back, the missing mechanical arm a stark reminder of the laboratory explosion. He was wearing a simple gray tunic instead of his decorated Vanguard uniform. "Dismissed, Miller," Thorne said to the medic. "I'm a doctor, not a private, Elias," she snapped back. But she gathered her tools and left the room anyway. Thorne sat on the edge of the adjacent bed, his one remaining hand resting on his knee. "You look like hell, Voss." "The feeling is mutual, sir. How's the city?" "It's a mess," Thorne said, sighing. "The purists have gone underground, but they're still planting pipe bombs in the Lithos districts. The corporate loyalists are trying to liquidate their assets and bug out to the surface colonies. And the council? They're arguing about whether to give the Lithos the right to vote or just the right to not be shot on sight. And the people. That's the strange part, Thorne said, looking out at the city. The people they're confused. I walked through the market today. I saw a group of humans helping a Lithos family rebuild their stall. Then 10 meters away, I saw a woman spit on a Lithos elder. It's like the whole city has a fever, and we're waiting to see if it breaks toward health or death. Kaelen reached for the small stone bird the Lithos woman had given him. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the smooth, cool texture of the ether stone. We broke their world, sir. We told them their heroes were murderers and their enemies were victims. You can't expect them to just flip a switch. No, you can't, Thorne agreed. But we have to keep the pressure on. Marcus Vane is in a high-security cell in the Spire. He's offering names of everyone on the board in exchange for a lighter sentence. He's trying to save his own skin by burning the rest of the company. Good, Kaelen said, his voice cold. Let him burn. There's a hearing tomorrow, Thorne said, his eyes fixing on Kaelen. The Public Safety Commission. They want to hear from the man who breached the transmitter. They want to know why a Vanguard hero turned on his own kind. Kaelen felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. What am I supposed to tell them? That I found out my brother died for a dividend? That I spent 4 years being a monster because it was easier than being a human? Tell them the truth, Kaelen, Thorne said. Tell them that the hardest battle isn't fought with a phase blade. It's fought in the mirror. Tell them about Jory. Tell them about Ilara. Thorne stood up, his posture still commanding, despite the missing arm. The peacekeepers are no longer a joke, Voss. We've had over 500 applications in the last 48 hours. Most of them are veterans. They're tired, Kaelen. They're just like you. They want to believe that all that blood was for something, even if the something was just a very expensive lesson in what not to do. I'll be there, sir, Kaelen said. Thorne nodded and walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. By the way, that Lithos child and his mother, they've been asking about you. They're staying at the Sector 12 medical tent. They're helping the human doctors understand Lithos anatomy. Apparently, resonance healing is a lot faster than our biogels. The door closed, leaving Kaelen alone with his thoughts. He looked at the stone bird again. It was a simple object, but it represented a choice. The choice to stop seeing the other as a statistic or a threat, and to start seeing them as a person with a history, a family, and a soul. Later that evening, Kaelen checked himself out of the ward. He ignored the protests of the automated medical droids and made his way down to the gills. He didn't take a transport, he walked. He wanted to feel the city. The gills were different now. The heavy, oppressive fear that usually hung over the slums had been replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. In one alleyway, he saw a group of children, human and Lithos, playing a game of tag. The Lithos child was faster, his crystalline feet clicking rhythmically on the metal floor, while the human children laughed and tried to keep up. It was such a small, mundane thing, but it made Kaelen stop in his tracks. A week ago, this scene would have ended in a riot. Today, it was just kids being kids. He reached the Sector 12 medical tent. It was a massive inflatable structure set up in a cleared-out warehouse. Inside, the air hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. He saw the mother, her skin a soft, healing lavender. She was standing over a human soldier who had been badly burned in the lab explosion. Her hands were hovering just inches above his skin, and a soft green glow was emanating from her fingers. The soldier, a man Kaelen recognized from the Vanguard, looked terrified but mesmerized. It doesn't hurt anymore, the soldier whispered. The resonance is a song for the cells, the woman replied, her voice a beautiful, harmonic chord. It tells them how to find their way back to the harmony of the whole. Kaelen watched for a long time. He saw human nurses working side by side with Lithos healers. He saw people sharing rations, sharing stories, and for the first time, sharing their grief. He realized that Jory had been right all those years ago at Greymore Peak. The Lithos weren't trying to destroy humanity. They were trying to save the world they both occupied. They were the heart friends, and humanity had spent a decade trying to silence the heart. Sergeant Voss, a voice vibrated behind him. He turned to see the Lithos child. The boy was holding a small tray of medical supplies. His amber eyes were bright with recognition. Hey, kid, Kaelen said, crouching down despite the protest of his side. How are you holding up? The air is better, the boy said, his voice clearer than before. The static has gone away. My mother says it is because the people are starting to listen to the planet again. I hope she's right, Kaelen said. She is always right, the boy said with a faint, crystalline click that sounded like a laugh. Are you still a peacekeeper, Kaelen? Kaelen looked at the staff on his back, then at the soldier being healed by the Lithos woman. He thought about the hearing tomorrow and the thousands of people who were still waiting for someone to tell them it was okay to stop hating. Yeah, Kaelen said, his voice steady. I think I'm finally getting the hang of it. He spent the rest of the night in the tent, helping move supplies and sitting with the wounded. He didn't talk much, but he listened. He listened to the stories of soldiers who had lost their friends and Lithos who had lost their homes. He realized that grief was the universal language, a frequency that everyone understood, regardless of the skin they wore. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the chemical haze of the gills, Kaelen walked back toward the spire. He wasn't the same man who had hunted Zara into an alley. He wasn't the man who had been defined by the white ash of his brother's death. He was a man who had seen the monsters and realized they were just people who had forgotten how to listen. And he was a man who was ready to tell the world that it was time to wake up. The Grand Hall of the Public Safety Commission was a cathedral of glass and white marble, designed to make the individual feel small and the law feel eternal. 7 commissioners sat on a raised dais, their faces illuminated by the soft, blue glow of their individual data slates. The gallery was packed with journalists, veterans, and citizens from every plate of Aethelgard. In the center of the room, standing at a lone podium, was Kaelen Voss. He wasn't wearing his armor. He was wearing a clean, simple peacekeeper uniform, dark blue with a silver branch on the lapel. He didn't look like a war hero. He looked like a man who had survived a long illness and was still finding his balance. "Sergeant Voss," the lead commissioner said, a man whose voice sounded like it had been synthesized by an ancient computer. "You have provided this commission with over 2 terabytes of internal Core Corp data. You have accused the board of directors of state-sponsored mass murder, including the intentional sabotage of the Greymore reactor. Do you understand the gravity of these claims?" "I do," Kaelen said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "And yet," the commissioner continued, "you were a member of the Vanguard. You were decorated for your valor in the very actions you now decry. Why the change of heart, Sergeant? Was it a sudden pang of guilt or something more political?" Kaelen looked up at the gallery. He saw Commander Thorne sitting in the front row, his one hand clenched in a fist. He saw the Lithos woman and her son, their iridescent skin a stark contrast to the drab grays of the human audience. He thought about the reflection in the alley, the scarred soldier with the raised blade. "It wasn't a sudden pang of anything," Kaelen said, his voice gaining strength. "It was a slow, painful realization that I was a coward." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The commissioner leaned forward. "A coward, Sergeant? You have more medals for bravery than most of this room combined." "Medals are easy," Kaelen said. "Killing is easy. It's a binary choice. You see a target, you pull a trigger, you go home and tell yourself you're the good guy because you survived. The real bravery is standing in front of someone you've been taught to hate, someone who has every reason to kill you, and choosing to listen instead. The real bravery is looking at the people you loved who died and realizing that their deaths don't justify more killing, they only highlight the waste of it all." He paused, his hand going to the side where his wound was still healing. "My brother Jory died at Greymore Peak. For 4 years, I carried his death like a weapon. I used it as an excuse to shut down my humanity. I thought I was honoring him by hunting the monsters who blew the reactor. But the truth is, the monsters were the ones who sent us there. The monsters were the ones who turned off the communications, so a 19-year-old kid couldn't tell his brother that the enemy was trying to save them." Kaelen looked directly at the camera drones hovering in the air. "We've spent a decade building a city in the sky, thinking we were better than the world below. But we've just been building a bigger cage. We've been fed a diet of fear and resentment because it makes us easier to control. Core Corp didn't just steal the ether. They stole our ability to see each other as human. And I'm here today to tell you that the debt is paid. The war is over, not because someone won, but because we finally stopped fighting the wrong people." The silence that followed was absolute. Then one person in the back of the gallery began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the hall was filled with a thunderous roar of applause, not for a victory, but for a truth that had been buried for too long. The hearing lasted for 6 more hours, but for Kaelen, the work was already done. He had spoken the words he should have said 4 years ago. He had finally brought Jory home. 6 months later, Aethelgard was a different city. The transition wasn't perfect. There were still protests, still tensions, and the integration of the Lithos into the urban structure was a slow, difficult process. But the change was undeniable. The peacekeepers were now the primary security force, and their training focused on de-escalation and cultural liaison work. Kaelen Voss stood on the edge of the mid-plate overlook, watching the sun set behind the jagged mountains of Vesper 4. Beside him, a young man in a trainee uniform was cleaning a pair of tactical goggles. The boy couldn't have been more than 18. "Sergeant?" the boy asked. "Yeah, Dunham? We've got a report of a dispute in Sector 8. A human shopkeeper is refusing to serve a Lithos customer. The crowd is starting to get loud." Kaelen looked at the boy. He saw the eagerness in his eyes, the desire to go in and fix the problem. He saw himself 15 years ago. "Leave the phase blade in the locker, Dunham," Kaelen said, reaching for his carbon fiber staff. "But sir, what if they get violent?" "Then we stand there and take it until they're too tired to hit us anymore," Kaelen said. "Then we talk. Then we find out why the shopkeeper is scared and why the customer is angry. We don't solve problems with edges, Dunham. We solve them with patience." The boy nodded, though he still looked a bit confused. "Yes, Sergeant." They walked toward the transport, their footsteps rhythmic on the metal plating. As they boarded, Kaelen looked back at the city. The lights were coming on, thousands of tiny sparks burning in the dark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small stone bird. He had added his own carving to it, a small, intricate spiral that intertwined with the bird's wings. It was a symbol of the connection between the sky and the earth, between the human and the Lithos. He thought about the weight of the stone. For years he had thought the weight was a burden, a punishment for surviving while others died. But he understood now that the weight was a gift. It was the weight of memory, the weight of responsibility, and the weight of hope. It was what kept you grounded when the world tried to blow you away. Kaelen Voss watched the transport shuttle bank toward the horizon, its engines a soft blue glow in the deepening twilight. He thought about the thousands of alleys in Aethelgard, and the thousands of people standing in them, caught between the past and the future. He wondered if they were ready to put their swords down. "I spent years carrying that anger like armor, only to realize it was a prison. I wonder, is there someone in your life you have been holding on to resentment against? What would it feel like to finally let it go?" Kaelen turned away from the edge and followed the young trainee into the shuttle, his staff clicking softly on the deck, a rhythmic sound of peace in a city that was finally learning how to breathe. He left the stone bird on the railing, a small glowing sentinel watching over the world below.